Remember those budget-friendly meals black mothers cooked in the 1950s? They turned scraps into suppers that filled bellies and lifted spirits. What tasty tricks did they know that we've nearly forgotten? Collard greens with salt pork were a survival dish that filled pots across black households in the 1950s, stretching meager ingredients into meals that lasted for days. Salt pork scraps, often overlooked by wealthier buyers, flavored the greens with smoky richness while providing just enough fat to make them satisfying. The collards themselves were homegrown or picked up cheaply from markets, making the dish accessible even when money was scarce. Mothers and grandmothers simmered the pot for hours, letting the greens soften and soak in every bit of flavor. The broth, called potlikker, was prized for its nutrients and sopped up with cornbread, so nothing was wasted. For many families, this dish was not just food, but medicine, a way of keeping strength up through lean times. It carried cultural pride as much as it carried nourishment, representing both resilience and resourcefulness. Today, collard greens remain a staple, but few remember that in the 1950s, they were lifelines, simmered with love and scraps to keep families strong through hardship. Cornbread skillet bread was the backbone of countless meals, baked right in heavy cast-iron pans that turned simple batter into golden, hearty wedges. Made from cornmeal, water, salt, and whatever fat was on hand, it could be cooked quickly and fed an entire family. When wheat flour was too expensive, cornbread became the daily bread that anchored suppers and breakfasts alike. Its dense texture soaked up potlikker from greens, carried gravies, and stretched stews into something more filling. Families treasured it because it required almost no special ingredients, just the basics from fields and pantries. Sweetened versions were rare in poor households, where every grain of sugar was saved, so the bread was most often savory and practical. Served hot from the skillet, it provided warmth and comfort on cold nights, eaten plain or with a dab of molasses if someone was lucky. Cornbread skillet bread was not just a side, it was survival itself, versatile, cheap, and woven into the rhythm of life. Red beans and rice stood tall as one of the most efficient meals of the 1950s, capable of feeding large families for days with minimal cost. The beans offered protein, the rice added bulk, and together they created a complete, filling dish that sustained both body and spirit. Cooked slowly on the stove, beans became creamy and flavorful, often seasoned with onions, garlic, or a scrap of ham bone if it was available. It was the kind of recipe that rewarded patience, turning the cheapest staples into something deeply satisfying. Mothers made huge pots that could stretch through several meals, reheated each day with flavors that only grew richer. For many, it was a taste of home and community, often served during gatherings where neighbors shared what little they had. Beyond nourishment, it was practical, because rice and beans were cheap, stored well, and required no complicated cooking. Red beans and rice became more than food. It was proof that with little, families could still find abundance and flavor. Pig's feet. Stew was the definition of making do with what others threw away, transforming discarded cuts into rich, savory meals. Pig's feet, cheap and often overlooked, were simmered for hours until the meat turned tender and the broth deep with flavor. Families paired it with vegetables like onions, carrots, or potatoes if they had them, stretching the stew further. The collagen from the feet created a thick, silky broth that felt more luxurious than the ingredients suggested. In many communities, this dish became a quiet source of pride, proving that nothing needed to be wasted. It reflected a deep cultural knowledge of how to coax nourishment from humble parts of the animal, keeping bellies full when options were few. Often served with cornbread, it was hearty enough to carry families through cold evenings and lean times. Pig's feet. Stew may not have looked glamorous, but it told a story of resilience and survival that carried across generations. Sweet potato biscuits were a creative way of stretching precious wheat flour while using what gardens could provide in abundance. Sweet potatoes, easy to grow and store, became the secret ingredient that gave biscuits sweetness, color, and body. Mothers mashed them into dough, adding just enough flour and fat to create something tender and warm. These biscuits filled kitchens with comfort and provided fuel for long days of work. They were served at breakfast with sorghum syrup or eaten at supper alongside beans or greens. For many families, they became an affordable luxury, a way to bring a little sweetness to the table without relying on expensive sugar. Children loved them for their soft texture and unique flavor, and adults valued how far they could stretch ingredients. Sweet potato biscuits were more than clever cooking. They represented a balance of necessity and creativity, proof that even in the toughest times, resourcefulness could create moments of joy. Black-eyed pea soup was a staple of lean nights, a protein-packed dish that provided comfort and sustenance when little else was available. Black-eyed peas, affordable and widely grown, simmered into a hearty soup that warmed families from the inside out. The dish was often flavored with onions, garlic, or scraps of cured meat, though it was nourishing even when cooked plain. Served with cornbread or rice, it created a meal that was simple, filling, and reliable. For many, it also carried symbolic meaning, tied to traditions of luck and prosperity. During the 1950s, however, it was primarily survival food, proof of how communities could thrive on legumes that kept costs low. Children grew up on the earthy taste of the soup, and families relied on it to stretch thin pantries. Black-eyed pea soup was both medicine and meal, a dish that blended culture and necessity while keeping countless families strong through hard times. Fried catfish was both sustenance and celebration, pulled from rivers and streams by those who depended on fishing for affordable protein. Catfish were plentiful, easy to catch, and provided large fillets that could be seasoned and fried crisp in cornmeal. Families often came together around the preparation, with community fish fries turning simple suppers into neighborhood events. Fried catfish became more than food. It was tradition, bringing people together during hard years when joy was hard to find. Served with hush puppies or greens, it offered comfort while reflecting a strong sense of place. The crisp golden crust and tender flesh became a favorite for children and adults alike. In the 1950s, when money was short, the ability to catch your dinner from a river meant freedom and survival. Fried catfish told a story of resourcefulness, community, and pride in making the most of what nature provided, even when times were unforgiving. Turnip greens with cornmeal dumplings turned garden scraps and pantry staples into a dish that could sustain whole families. Turnip greens, often overlooked in favor of the root, were simmered into a flavorful broth that made the most of what was available. Cornmeal dumplings, cheap and filling, floated on top, soaking in the savory liquid until soft and satisfying. Together, they created a meal that cost almost nothing yet delivered both nutrition and comfort. This dish was especially common in rural households where gardens provided greens, but money for meat was scarce. The dumplings acted as the backbone, stretching the pot into something that could serve many mouths. Families passed recipes down, adding small touches like onions or peppers when they had the means. For many, it was a taste of both survival and heritage, reminding them of how ingenuity kept households fed. Turnip greens with cornmeal dumplings became more than just food. It was resilience served in a steaming bowl. Braised oxtails with gravy were another example of resourceful cooking, turning tough, inexpensive cuts into rich and comforting meals. Oxtails, once considered scraps, were simmered for hours until the meat fell tender from the bone and the broth thickened into gravy. Families stretched the dish by serving it over rice or potatoes, ensuring every drop went further. Though it required patience, the end result was hearty, flavorful, and deeply satisfying. It became a Sunday dinner favorite in many households, reserved for when families wanted something special without spending much. The dish reflected a culture that knew how to turn difficulty into flavor, coaxing the best out of what was available. Children often fought over the bones, savoring every last bit of meat and gravy. Braised oxtails with gravy may have started as a humble survival recipe, but it grew into a treasured comfort meal that carried pride, tradition, and the spirit of making the most of little. Molasses cornmeal. Porridge was a breakfast built on necessity, made from the simplest staples and sweetened with molasses when sugar was too costly. Cornmeal boiled into a thick porridge formed the base, hearty enough to fuel long days of work. The addition of molasses added both flavor and energy, turning an otherwise plain bowl into something more comforting. Mothers prepared it for children before school, and families ate it together on cold mornings when other options were scarce. It filled stomachs quickly and used ingredients that were always on hand in rural households. Molasses was cheaper than refined sugar, making it a go-to for sweetening. The porridge could be eaten plain or with a splash of milk if available, creating small luxuries out of simple ingredients. Though modest, it carried warmth and stability during uncertain times. Molasses cornmeal porridge was proof that even in the toughest years, resourcefulness and care could turn basics into sustaining comfort. Pinto bean chili was the kind of dish that took the humblest pantry ingredients and turned them into something filling enough to carry a family through the week. Pinto beans were cheap, hearty, and easy to store, making them perfect for lean years when meat was scarce. Families would simmer them slowly with onions, peppers, and spices, and if they were fortunate enough to have a little ground beef or scraps of pork, they would stir those in too. The result was a thick, smoky stew that stretched flavor and sustenance far beyond what the ingredients suggested. Every bite carried warmth, and the spices masked the lack of meat so no one felt deprived. Pinto bean chili became a staple at kitchen tables, not just because it was affordable, but because it was adaptable, able to be eaten with rice, cornbread, or on its own. It kept families fed, bellies warm, and spirits lifted in times when resources were few and creativity was essential for survival. Rabbit stew was a survival dish that leaned heavily on resourcefulness, relying on wild-caught game to provide protein when store-bought meat was out of reach. Families living near fields or wooded areas often turned to hunting small game like rabbit to keep meals going. The meat, though lean, became tender and flavorful when simmered low and slow with vegetables such as potatoes, carrots, or onions. It was a dish that required patience, but rewarded it with a rich broth and enough food to feed many mouths. For children, it was often their introduction to the reality that dinner did not always come from a store. Rabbit stew represented a connection to the land, as well as the necessity of making use of every available resource. It was not a luxury meal, but a practical one, carrying pride for those who could provide for their families with skill and effort. Rabbit stew was proof that survival often depended on ingenuity and determination. Okra and tomato stew carried deep Southern and African roots, becoming a staple dish when vegetables from the garden needed to be stretched into hearty suppers. Okra, with its thickening qualities, blended with tomatoes to create a silky, flavorful stew that was filling even without meat. Families would add onions, peppers, and sometimes corn, creating a dish that tasted like comfort in a bowl. The stew simmered slowly, and the longer it cooked, the more the flavors came together into something rich and satisfying. For many, it was tied to cultural heritage, reflecting traditions that reached back across generations. Okra and tomato stew was easy to make, affordable and nourishing, providing warmth and strength at a time when both were needed. It became a reminder of resilience, with each pot feeding more than just bodies but also preserving identity. At the dinner table, this stew brought people together, showing that food could carry both history and survival in every single bite. Crackling cornbread was a dish born from thrift, turning leftover pork skins into something rich and memorable. Cornmeal, water, and a little fat created the base, while the addition of crunchy cracklings gave each bite texture and flavor that plain cornbread could not match. It was a clever way to use every part of the pig, ensuring nothing went to waste during hard times. Families often baked it in cast-iron skillets, where the edges crisped up and the center stayed tender. Served alongside greens, beans, or stews, it became both a side and a treat in its own right. Crackling cornbread carried the smoky taste of pork and the heartiness of cornmeal, making it perfect for filling stomachs and lifting spirits. Children especially loved the crispy bits hidden inside. It was food that showed how resourcefulness could turn scraps into something treasured. Crackling cornbread remains a cultural symbol of resilience, proof that even humble ingredients could create comfort. Smothered pork chops turned inexpensive, tough cuts into tender, flavorful meals that fed families when money was tight. The chops were seared, then simmered in rich onion or mushroom gravy until they softened and soaked up every bit of flavor. Served with rice or mashed potatoes, they stretched far beyond the small portions of meat that went into the pan. This dish showed how skill and patience could transform affordable cuts into something that felt hearty and comforting. Smothered pork chops became a Sunday dinner favorite in many households, offering the illusion of luxury even when ingredients were modest. Families appreciated that it was both filling and delicious, making it a repeat on weekly menus. For children, the dish carried nostalgia as a special treat, while adults valued its practicality and affordability. Smothered pork chops were the definition of survival cooking, reminding families that with time, creativity, and a good gravy, even tough times could taste tender. Rice and gravy suppers turned the simplest pantry item into a sustaining meal that carried families through countless lean nights. Rice was cheap, filling, and easy to cook in large amounts, making it an essential staple in many homes. What gave it character was the gravy, often made from pan drippings, onions, flour, and water, transformed into something savory and rich. Even when meat was scarce, the flavor of gravy brought comfort, giving plain rice new life. This meal proved that survival cooking was not about excess, but about making the most of what was available. Families could stretch small scraps into flavorings that fed everyone at the table. It was warm, nourishing, and familiar, offering stability in a time when many other things were uncertain. Rice and gravy suppers may have been modest, but they filled stomachs and hearts alike, making them one of the most important dishes for survival and community during tough decades. Stewed cowpeas were a dish that carried clear echoes of West African foodways, keeping cultural traditions alive while also providing affordable nourishment. Cowpeas, grown widely in fields, were simmered slowly with simple seasonings like onions, garlic, or salt pork if available. The peas developed a creamy texture as they cooked, creating a dish that was both filling and flavorful. For families, it was a way of stretching harvests into meals that could last for days. Cowpeas were affordable, durable, and reliable, making them a lifeline for many households during hard times. The stew paired perfectly with cornbread or rice, turning simple ingredients into something complete and comforting. Beyond nourishment, it carried heritage, tying families to ancestral practices of making the most of legumes. Stewed cowpeas embodied resilience and resourcefulness, showing how traditions endured even in adversity. For many, it was more than food. It was history simmering on the stove. Homemade sorghum syrup cake was a sweet treat born out of necessity, making use of local sorghum syrup when sugar was too costly. The cake batter was simple, relying on flour, eggs, and syrup for both sweetness and moisture. Baked in family kitchens, it filled homes with a rich, comforting aroma that lifted spirits even when pantries were bare. Sorghum was cheaper and more accessible than refined sugar, making it the go-to sweetener in many rural communities. The cake was often saved for Sunday dinners or special occasions, giving families something to look forward to. Children treasured every slice, savoring the sticky sweetness that felt rare in lean years. Adults valued how the recipe stretched simple ingredients into something celebratory. Homemade sorghum syrup cake was proof that even in hardship, joy could still be found at the table. It was a dessert that carried culture, thrift, and love in every bite, disappearing almost as quickly as it was served. Fried green tomatoes were a clever way to make use of unripe fruit that otherwise would have gone to waste. Sliced thick, dipped in cornmeal, and fried until crisp, they turned tart tomatoes into golden rounds of comfort. This dish became a Southern staple, particularly in households where gardens were vital for survival. It was both affordable and practical, making sure nothing from the harvest went unused. Served as a side dish or even as the centerpiece of a meal, fried green tomatoes carried both tang and crunch that satisfied young and old alike. The recipe was simple but effective, proving that ingenuity could transform even unready produce into something cherished. Families treasured the dish as a reminder that waste was not an option, and creativity was always in the kitchen. Fried green tomatoes were food that spoke of both necessity and joy, crisp reminders of resilience in every bite. Boiled hog maw may not sound appealing to modern ears, but in the 1950s it was a testament to using every possible part of the pig. Hog maw, the pig's stomach, was cleaned thoroughly and simmered until tender, often with onions, peppers, and potatoes. It stretched the animal further, making sure nothing was wasted when money was scarce. Though the texture was unusual, the flavor was savory, especially when seasoned well. Families that relied on thrift-prized hog maw for its affordability and ability to feed many mouths. It was often served with cornbread or rice, making the meal both practical and filling. The dish carried cultural roots as well, passed down in communities that valued resourcefulness and tradition. While it may not be common today, boiled hog maw represented survival cooking at its most inventive. It turned what others discarded into sustenance, showing that resilience could be found in every pot, no matter the ingredient. Pickled watermelon rinds were the very definition of waste, not want not, turning scraps into something bright and flavorful at a time when nothing could be thrown away. Families peeled the white rinds, boiled them with vinegar, sugar, and spices, then stored them in jars to last for weeks. The result was a tangy, crunchy pickle that accompanied heavy meals, cutting through the richness of beans, pork, or stews. It gave people the satisfaction of having something that felt almost fancy, even though it was made from what would otherwise have been tossed aside. Children sometimes loved the sweet-sour flavor, while others found it odd, but nearly everyone appreciated the practicality. Pickled watermelon rinds also carried cultural roots, with recipes passed down across generations in Southern households. They became a reminder that creativity and thrift could bring new life to even the humblest scraps. Long before sustainability was a trend, this dish made sure no part of the harvest was wasted, providing both flavor and memory in every crunchy bite. Mustard greens with hot pepper vinegar brought bold flavor to kitchens that otherwise depended on simple staples. Mustard greens, sharp and slightly bitter, were simmered slowly until tender, often with onions, garlic, or small scraps of pork for added richness. What made them special was the addition of homemade hot pepper vinegar, a condiment made by steeping fresh peppers in vinegar. A splash over the greens transformed them, brightening the flavor and adding just the right amount of heat. Families leaned on this dish as both a daily side and a symbol of resilience, since greens were easy to grow and the vinegar stretched flavor far. In poor households, it often became the centerpiece of the meal, eaten with cornbread and little else. It carried deep ties to Southern foodways and African traditions, reminding families of both heritage and ingenuity. Mustard greens with hot pepper vinegar turned frugality into comfort, showing that even the simplest pot of greens could taste like a celebration. Cowtail stew was a dish that proved how patience could transform the least expensive cuts into nourishing, satisfying meals. Cowtails, later known as oxtails, were once considered scraps, sold cheaply to families who needed affordable protein. When simmered low and slow, the meat softened and released a deep, gelatinous richness that turned broths into silky gravies. Families would add onions, carrots, potatoes, and whatever vegetables they had, stretching the dish further to feed as many mouths as possible. Served with rice or cornbread, it became a hearty and complete meal. The long cooking time was worth it because the result was tender meat clinging to bones and broth that carried warmth on cold nights. Cowtail stew became a classic in many households, not because it was glamorous, but because it was practical and nourishing. It reflected resilience and the ability to draw strength from what others overlooked, turning scraps into comfort. It was survival, love, and resourcefulness simmered together in a pot. Cornmeal mush with milk was one of the simplest and cheapest meals on the table, stretching a bag of cornmeal into countless bowls of sustenance. Families would boil cornmeal with water until it thickened into a porridge, serving it hot for breakfast, lunch, or dinner. For children, it was often softened with milk or sweetened with molasses if the family could spare it. For adults, it might be eaten plain with salt or even sliced cold the next day and fried for variety. The dish was beloved for its versatility and its ability to keep hunger away with minimal cost. It reflected the reality of survival cooking: simple, repetitive, but nourishing. In poor households, cornmeal mush appeared so often that it became both a comfort and a reminder of scarcity. Yet it carried a certain pride, because even with little, families found ways to make it stretch. Cornmeal mush with milk was proof that frugality and resourcefulness kept households alive through lean years. Homemade Blackberry cobbler was a taste of sweetness born from the land, created when families foraged wild berries and stretched pantry staples into dessert. Blackberries grew freely along fences, fields, and back roads, providing a free source of fruit during summer months. Families gathered buckets full, turning them into cobblers with flour, sugar, and lard or butter if they had it. The dessert bubbled in ovens until the crust browned and the fruit turned syrupy, filling homes with an aroma that promised comfort. For children, it was a rare treat in years when sweets were scarce and every bite felt like a luxury. Adults treasured it too, not just for the flavor but for what it represented: community, gathering, and joy in the midst of hardship. Served with milk or cream when available, Blackberry cobbler became the centerpiece of Sunday meals. It was not just dessert, but a moment of brightness that lifted spirits. Homemade Blackberry cobbler showed how nature's gifts could sweeten even the leanest times. Field pea hoppin'. John was a dish with African roots that carried both tradition and sustenance to countless families. Made from black-eyed peas or field peas cooked with rice and a touch of pork or seasoning, it provided a complete meal with protein and starch in one pot. Families valued it for its ability to feed many mouths with minimal ingredients, stretching harvests and scraps far. The dish was also tied to cultural meaning, often eaten for good luck and prosperity at the New Year. In the 1950s, however, it was survival food, appearing regularly at dinner tables because it was cheap, practical, and nourishing. The rice and peas combination kept stomachs full, while the pork or seasoning added just enough richness to keep it from feeling plain. Hoppin' John was proof that culture and necessity could live in harmony, feeding both the body and the spirit. It stood as a reminder of heritage, resilience, and the creative strength of communities that thrived against the odds. Ash-baked sweet potatoes were as simple as survival food could get, roasted directly in fire embers until steaming hot and soft inside. Families who could not afford sugar or butter still found joy in the natural sweetness of the potatoes themselves. They were dug from gardens or bought cheaply at markets, making them one of the most reliable crops during lean times. Once baked, the skin charred while the flesh became creamy, filling bellies and providing much-needed energy. For children, pulling a hot sweet potato from the ashes felt like unwrapping a gift, even when other luxuries were absent. Adults valued how they could be eaten alone as a meal or served alongside greens or beans. Ash-baked sweet potatoes required no pantries full of ingredients, just patience and fire. They were both humble and celebratory, proving that even in scarcity, nature could provide warmth and sweetness. This dish was food, comfort, and memory rolled into one. Stewed chicken necks and backs were another example of stretching affordable cuts into full meals, simmered until tender with vegetables and broth. Necks and backs were often sold cheaply at butcher shops, since they were less desirable than breast or thigh meat. Families used them to flavor soups and stews, extracting every bit of richness from bones and scraps. The result was broth that tasted hearty and filling, even if the actual meat was limited. Onions, carrots, or potatoes might be added if available, turning the pot into something that could feed many mouths. It was not glamorous, but it was survival food that kept households nourished. Children often fished for the tiny bits of meat clinging to bones, while adults prized the broth itself for both flavor and sustenance. Stewed chicken necks and backs represented frugality at its most practical, ensuring nothing was wasted. It proved that even the humblest scraps could stretch into nourishing meals for entire families. Molasses cookies were a sweet solution to the problem of expensive sugar, using affordable molasses to create treats that brightened kitchens. The dough was simple: Flour, lard or butter, baking soda, and molasses stirred into a sticky batter. When baked, they spread into chewy cookies with a deep, rich sweetness unlike anything sugar could provide. Families relied on them because they required no rare ingredients and could be made in large batches to last the week. Children adored them as after-school snacks, and adults valued how far a jar of molasses could stretch in the kitchen. Molasses cookies carried the flavor of thrift, resilience, and comfort, offering something special even in difficult years. They showed that dessert did not have to disappear just because resources were low. With every bite, they reminded families that joy could be found even in the smallest indulgences. Molasses cookies were proof that resourcefulness was as important in desserts as it was in survival suppers. Cabbage and fatback fry was a dish that proved how humble vegetables could become meals with the help of flavorful scraps. Cabbage was cheap, easy to grow, and available in abundance, while fatback, the fatty part of pork, added richness and flavor. Families shredded cabbage, fried it in fatback drippings, and seasoned it with salt and pepper for a simple but hearty dish. Sometimes potatoes or onions were added, but even on its own, it stretched into a filling supper. This recipe embodied the thrift and ingenuity of survival cooking, making much out of little. For many, it became a weekly staple, appearing on tables not because it was fancy, but because it worked. Cabbage and fatback fry was beloved for its balance of simplicity and comfort, carrying smoky flavor into every bite. It reflected cultural traditions as well as the harsh reality of stretching food as far as possible. This dish showed resilience on a plate, nourishing families with warmth and care. Stewed squirrel with dumplings was once a common sight in rural kitchens, where small game played a vital role in feeding families. After a successful hunt, squirrels were skinned, cleaned, and simmered slowly with onions, carrots, and celery until the meat became tender enough to fall from the bone. Soft dumplings made from flour and lard or butter were dropped into the bubbling broth, soaking up the savory flavors. This dish was especially valued in the cooler months when fresh meat was scarce and every source of protein mattered. In African American communities with hunting traditions, stewed squirrel was as practical as it was comforting, turning a modest catch into a hearty, filling meal. The dumplings stretched the stew further, ensuring there was enough to feed everyone at the table. While many today have never considered squirrel as food, for those who grew up with it, the taste was familiar, mild, and satisfying, especially when paired with the soft, pillowy dumplings. It was a dish born from necessity, but one that carried a sense of home and shared effort, and a retro glamour that felt just right for a Saturday night gathering or a holiday feast. Brown sugar and butter melted into a sticky glaze at the bottom of a cast-iron skillet, ready to cradle bright rings of canned pineapple and scattered maraschino cherries. A light vanilla batter was poured on top and baked until golden, allowing the juices to soak upward and infuse the cake with tropical sweetness. When the pan was flipped, the reveal always earned a gasp as the glossy fruit topping shimmered like stained glass. Served slightly warm, each slice combined tender crumb with a syrupy tang that no frosting could match. In African American homes of the 1970s, it stood as a link between old-fashioned hospitality and modern convenience, using simple canned fruit to create a dessert of striking beauty. Pineapple upside-down cake reminded families that a little drama in presentation could turn an ordinary evening into a celebration, remembered long after the plates were cleared. Wild plum chutney offered a burst of tart sweetness when sugar was scarce and fruit trees grew untended along plantation edges. Gatherers picked the small, deeply colored plums at peak ripeness and simmered them slowly with a little honey or molasses when available, along with wild herbs for spice. The result was a tangy preserve that enlivened cornbread, salted meats, or simple porridge, providing vitamins and variety in otherwise plain meals. This method of combining fruit with savory seasonings echoed West African chutneys and relishes, demonstrating a culinary bridge between continents. After freedom, African American home cooks continued to prize wild plums for jellies and sauces, and many Southern families still make small-batch plum preserves each summer. The enduring appeal of wild plum chutney lies in its ability to turn overlooked fruit into a bright condiment that brightens any table. It stands as a flavorful link between survival cooking and the rich tapestry of modern Southern preserves that celebrate both heritage and the gifts of the wild landscape. Cowpea and collard stew combine two powerhouse ingredients that sustained countless families through hard times. Field peas, also known as cowpeas, were simmered slowly with smoky meat and joined by hearty collard greens, creating a dish rich in protein, vitamins, and earthy flavor. The long cooking process filled homes with an aroma that signaled comfort and nourishment. Farmers valued cowpeas for their ability to thrive in poor soil, while collards offered leaves long after other vegetables had withered. Together, they made a meal that cost little but fed many, reflecting a tradition of resourcefulness and care. Mothers and grandmothers seasoned the pot with onions, garlic, and pepper, each adding a personal touch passed down through generations. Families gathered around the table with slices of cornbread to soak up the flavorful broth, finding strength in every spoonful. Though supermarkets now offer endless choices, the slow-simmered union of cowpeas and collards stands as a reminder of a time when simple ingredients created enduring nourishment. Fried bream with hush puppies was a meal born from rivers, ponds, and hands that knew how to fish. Bream, small and plentiful, cost little more than the time spent catching them. My grandmother cleaned the fish, rolled them in cornmeal, and fried them crisp in hot oil until the skin crackled golden brown. Hush puppies bubbled alongside, little cornmeal fritters that were cheap to mix and cooked quickly. Together, they made a dinner that felt rich without draining a wallet. Families gathered around plates piled high, dipping hush puppies into hot sauce or eating them plain while the fish cooled. The taste was pure Southern tradition, simple, salty, and tied to the land and water. In the 1960s, when grocery stores were expensive, fishing poles and cast nets provided meals for families who had little to spare. Fried bream with hush puppies was more than food. It was a reminder of resourcefulness and community, where the catch of the day fed everyone at the table. Sweet potato biscuits brought a touch of sweetness to the bread basket, making them a beloved addition to breakfasts and suppers alike. Mashed sweet potatoes were mixed into biscuit dough, giving the bread a soft texture, golden color, and natural sweetness that paired perfectly with both savory and sweet toppings. These biscuits could be enjoyed with fried chicken, drizzled with sorghum syrup, or simply spread with fresh butter. In African American kitchens, especially in the South, they were a way to use leftover baked sweet potatoes and add variety to everyday bread. The earthy sweetness of the potatoes balanced beautifully with the rich, buttery crumb of the biscuit, making them a favorite at church gatherings, Sunday dinners, and holiday meals. They baked up tender yet sturdy, with just enough sweetness to feel special without becoming dessert. Today, sweet potato biscuits are less common outside of certain regions, often replaced by standard white biscuits, but those who remember them speak of their warmth, flavor, and the way they brought people to the table with smiles. Peach cobbler with biscuit topping was the heart of many summer evenings in African American homes of the 1970s, a dessert that tasted like sunshine caught in a pan. Juicy peaches were tossed with brown sugar, lemon juice, and a whisper of cinnamon until their natural syrup began to bubble. Over this golden fruit, a blanket of soft biscuit dough was dropped in spoonfuls, each one browning to a tender crust as the oven worked its magic. The scent of warm fruit and butter drifted through open windows, calling neighbors to stop by for a plate. Served with a drizzle of fresh cream or a scoop of homemade ice cream, every bite balanced tart peach with sweet, flaky topping. Families loved how the cobbler came together from simple pantry staples yet felt luxurious enough for company. It carried the legacy of Southern kitchens into a modern decade, proving that when peaches are ripe and the air is warm, nothing brings people together faster than the promise of a bubbling pan of cobbler shared straight from the oven. Apple brown. Betty brought Depression-era thrift into bay leaf infusion offered warmth and gentle comfort, using one of the few aromatic plants that grew wild near plantation quarters. Fresh or dried bay leaves were gathered from native bay trees, and steeped in hot water to create a soothing tea with a light floral scent and mild medicinal qualities. This infusion was believed to aid digestion and ease colds, and it provided a calming moment during hard days. The knowledge of bay's healing properties came from both African herbal traditions and local indigenous practices, merging into a shared understanding of the land's quiet gifts. Even after emancipation, African American communities continued to brew bay tea for health and hospitality, and its subtle fragrance remains a hallmark of Southern kitchens where bay leaves still flavor soups and stews. Bay leaf infusion stands as a gentle reminder that survival was not only about calories but also about care, showing how enslaved people drew strength and solace from the natural world around them. Sorghum syrup biscuits with milk were the kind of dinner that showed how families found sweetness even in struggle. Sorghum syrup, cheaper than sugar, was kept in jars that seemed to last forever, poured generously over hot biscuits fresh from the oven. My grandmother baked the biscuits with flour and lard, ingredients that could be stretched and shared across multiple meals. Once the biscuits were ready, she split them open, drizzled them with syrup, and served them with cold milk poured into glasses. It was simple but filling, providing enough energy for tired workers and growing children. The sweetness of the syrup turned plain flour biscuits into something that felt like a treat, even if it was just supper. In the 1960s, this kind of meal reminded families that comfort did not always need meat or elaborate dishes. It was about making do with what was on hand and finding joy in it. Sorghum syrup biscuits with milk were a reminder that sweetness could soften the edge of hardship. Hog's head. Cheese was not a cheese at all, but a savory meatloaf rich with history. Made by simmering a pig's head until the meat fell from the bone, it was mixed with onions, peppers, vinegar, and spices, then poured into molds with its own gelatin-rich broth. Once chilled, it firmed into slices that could be served cold, often with crackers, mustard, or fresh bread. For African American families, this dish was part of the tradition of whole animal cooking, born out of necessity and refined over generations. The flavor was robust, the texture a blend of tender meat and smooth jelly, and it could last several days in the icebox. It was not just about thrift, it was also about preserving flavor and creating something celebratory out of humble beginnings. Many elders recall it being a special treat, particularly in rural areas where fresh meat was not always available year-round. Today, its preparation is a fading art, remembered mostly by those who learned it from watching a grandparent work patiently over a simmering pot. Corncob jelly turned what most people threw away into a shimmering golden spread that brightened plain breads and biscuits. After kernels were cut from the cob for other uses, the remaining cores were boiled for a long time to draw out natural starch and pectin. The liquid was strained, sweetened with a modest amount of sugar or honey when available, and cooked again until it thickened into a soft jelly with a delicate corn flavor. Enslaved cooks perfected this transformation, ensuring nothing went to waste and every scrap contributed to nourishment. Long after emancipation, rural homesteaders and Depression-era families embraced corncob jelly as a thrifty delicacy, and it still appears at Southern craft fairs and heritage festivals. The gentle sweetness and faintly toasted aroma offer a taste of memory and ingenuity. Corncob jelly proves that culinary creativity can turn the most humble remnants of the harvest into something beautiful, a spread that honors the perseverance of those who found flavor and comfort in the very parts of the plant others overlooked. Okra and tomato succotash brought color and heritage together in one bubbling skillet. Fresh okra pods, sliced thin, mingled with sweet ripe tomatoes, corn kernels, onions, and peppers, creating a medley that linked West African traditions with Native American harvests. The dish simmered until the vegetables melded into a savory stew, thickened naturally by the okra's silken texture. Farmers' markets once overflowed with the ingredients every late summer, and families counted on succotash to stretch their crops and fill their tables. It was a side dish that could stand as a main course when meat was scarce, and its bright flavors paired beautifully with cornbread or rice. Elders told stories of ancestors who carried seeds and memories across oceans and frontiers, weaving history into every spoonful. Though many still grow okra and corn, the slow, careful preparation of true succotash has become rare, replaced by frozen blends and quick sautés that cannot match the patient flavor of the old garden skillet. Which of these budget-friendly dishes would you try? Tell us in the comments, like the video, and subscribe for more food history.